The Syrian Civil War is a very complex and fragile topic which has garnered the attention of all the major powers in the world and has left the country in economic ruin and has created millions of casualties, not just in Syria, but all over the world. The conflict begins in the late 2000s when the Arabs, during a cultural revolution against the corrupt or repressive governments in the Middle East, made claim in Syria. Protesters began peacefully against the oppressive and corrupt President Assad, but the peaceful protests were met with shots fired from the Syrian government, sparking the civil war in 2011. Armed rebel groups formed and were aided by defective Syrian troops and extremists from all over the region. The rebel groups became more and more extreme, and the notorious Al-Qaeda formed their new branch in Syria, al-Nusra. As the war progressed, the Kurdish group of Muslims also received weapons and seceded from Assad's rule in the north of Syria. Their fight is separate from the rebel groups in the south. As this conflict progressed, the war became a proxy war, meaning that regional powers outside of Syria became involved as well. Iran was the first to intervene by aiding Assad's forces by sending hundreds of cargo ships and getting a lot of boots on the ground. To combat this, the Gulf states, led primarily by Saudi Arabia, sent money and weapons to the rebels via Turkey in an effort to merely contest Iran's influence. In addition to Iran's already substantial help, they instructed the Lebanese Shia group Hezbollah to fight alongside Assad. In a constant back and forth, Saudi Arabia continued to send money and weapons to the rebels, this time through Jordan. One thing that is paramount to understand is that the Assad, Iran, Hezbollah side are all Shia Muslims, and the rebels are Sunni Muslims. This adds to the narrative of religious disputes causing massive issues in the Middle East. The conflicting beliefs are especially essential in the cause of this horrific war. In 2013, about 3 years since the conflict had begun, Assad used chemical warfare to kill almost 1,700 rebels and innocent civilians. This violent act fully triggered a U.S. response and the threat of an airstrike against Assad and his atrocities. Just 3 days after, Russia proposed that Syria should give up their chemical weaponry to the international community for dismantling. Though it may seem in the interest of peace, which is partially true, Russia's passive actions are in support of Assad's regime. The USA did not follow through on the threatened airstrike, but they did begin their CIA initiative to train rebel soldiers. In February of 2014, the game completely changed. ISIS is born. Well, not exactly. To fully understand ISIS's role in the Syrian Civil War, we need to understand their history as well. Their story begins when the recently disbanded Al-Qaeda, by the way of U.S. invasion, maintained their forces and moved into the relatively stable Iraq circa 2004. Just 5 years later, when the Syrian War began, AQI, or Al-Qaeda in Iraq, was still alive, but not a threat or even a presence to any Middle Eastern country or group. President Assad of Syria, in an act to stop the rebels, released jihadists and Islamic extremists to join their forces. This may seem counterintuitive, but the incentive is that it makes more difficult for foreign powers to support the rebels because they cannot be backed by these foreign powers because of their extremist values. At this point, the AQI had changed their name to the ISI, or the Islamic State of Iraq, and was led by a scholar by the name of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. This was where their involvement in the war begins. Baghdadi sent a top deputy to establish a new branch of the ISI / Al-Qaeda in Syria to fight alongside the rebels. In the meantime, he attacked a series of prisons, releasing jihadists and extremists and getting them to join his ranks, making the ISI power even stronger. In 2013, Baghdadi said that he is taking control of Al-Qaeda's allied forces, and the ISI expanded to Syria, making them the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or better known as ISIS. After this excommunication from Al-Qaeda, ISIS grew increasingly large in Syria, which is in part due to Assad's tolerance of the group. ISIS played a major role in switching the focus from stopping Assad to stopping them by disbanding domestic forces in the country and becoming the center of attention. This distracted many foreign powers from worrying about the Syrian government. ISIS, a Sunni Muslim group, marched through Iraq, quickly defeating the weak and corrupted Iraqi army in 2014. By overthrowing the Shia-dominated and increasingly authoritarian Iraqi government, most people welcomed or tolerated the ISIS invasion. ISIS controlled 1/3 of Iraq at that point. The ISIS territory is referred to them as the new caliphate. The holy war that ISIS wishes to evoke on the world is more audacious than anything the former Al-Qaeda had thought of. ISIS believes that this war will bring about the apocalypse, as foretold in Muslim scripture. Though their message is incredibly extreme and horrifying, thousands of Muslims from across the Middle East, Europe, and Africa traveled to join the group. At surface level, it may seem that these Muslims share the extremist values as ISIS and are joining for religious freedom almost, and this is in part true. However, most people who do join are more likely dealing with inner turmoil and are joining to seek answers and purpose from ISIS. ISIS's reign of terror continued with the genocide of Iraqis. The filmed murder of American journalist James Foley provoked U.S. airstrikes across their territory. ISIS could not withstand the attack and lost about 1/5 of the land that they had at that point. In response to these targeted drone strikes, ISIS organized and launched shocking terror attacks across the world, from Kuwait to Tunisia to Sinai to Beirut, and most notably Paris and Brussels. These attacks inspired lone wolf terrorists to act alone in the name of ISIS. We see this in examples like Orlando, Florida in the U.S., and Nice, France, where the terrorists in these situations may not have had the directive from ISIS, but felt compelled to do these things in light of recent events. ISIS makes a massive difference in the involvement in the war because their presence and actions create dilemmas with most of the powers involved. The focus of the war for each side is different and complex. For the USA, their involvement has shifted greatly in the timeline of the Civil War. At first, the United States' participation was to assist the rebels and fight the corrupt and oppressive power of Assad. But now, because ISIS is such a world threat, it seems that the U.S. are now focused on preventing the growth of ISIS in Syria and Iraq, and cracking down on ISIS's influence domestically. In addition to the U.S.'s focus on ISIS, they are politically obligated to fight Assad because of his Russian backing, as Russia is an adversary of the U.S. The internal conflicts of the groups engaged in combat expand much greater than just the U.S. The rebels, who are tainted by extremism and jihadism via Assad's release of Islamic extremists and jihadists into their ranks, have also done terrible and morally hypocritical acts of violence, making it extremely difficult for foreign powers to support their cause. In their attempts to overthrow Assad, they also have to battle ISIS. This creates a similar predicament to the U.S. Should the rebels focus on defeating Assad or defeating ISIS? So far in this essay, I have merely presented the facts, the timeline, and the politics of the Syrian Civil War. However, the second part of the task was to present the evidence and have a positive, optimistic outlook on the situation, and an outlook with a negative, pessimistic view of the situation. To look at this with an optimistic view, though the evidence is really haunting regarding death tolls and the things each respective group have done to each other, there does seem to be a solution in the future. It's a multi-step, highly expensive solution, but it will eventually bring peace to this region and stability for at least a short time. The first part of this puzzle is eliminating ISIS. As of now, the ISIS caliphate, or miniature state in Iraq and Syria, is shrinking beneath them, as is their resources. They have no proper funding or support from any major power, and all their former alliances have been destroyed. With ISIS out of the picture, the war becomes less diverse but equally complex. The origins of this war, the bare-bones foundation of this conflict, gets down to the Syrian people, specifically the Sunni Muslims, rising up against an oppressive and authoritarian government who prioritizes the Alawite population of Syria instead of treating everyone as equal. According to experts, but also in my own personal opinion, the resignation and arrest of Bashar al-Assad is necessary, and in place a non-corrupt leader that stands for civil rights, free speech, and equality. If terms to the people are met and held up, then the violence should come to an end. Foreign involvement, however, has made this issue so much more complicated. A brief summary is that the U.S. is anti-Assad, but has trouble supporting rebel groups in opposition to him because of their own extreme actions. Russia is pro-Assad because of their personal connection between Assad's father, Hafez, and Assad, and Russia's stakes in Syria's oil reserves as of now. So the defeat of Assad would possibly create a shift in economic policy regarding oil, causing Russia to lose money. The removal of Russia would disband the coalition between the Kremlin and Iran, Iraq, and Syria. The best case scenario is that Russia removes military force, which is completely airborne at this point, and ceases to influence the Syrian government. China, who has a growing economic interest in Middle Eastern oil, also would be affected by a change in rule and should pull out immediately. That was a brief reflection on my part on how this crisis can improve and how Syria as a country can regain peace and economic/social stability. The last few paragraphs were more future-oriented, and though basically everything about this war has been atrocious and dehumanizing, the efforts to welcome and support Syrian refugees in countries like Germany, Austria, Sweden, Greece, Italy, the United Kingdom, Turkey, and France is a positive in my view. These countries who don't necessarily owe Syria anything are opening their arms and allowing thousands of men, women, and children to come to safety and start over in a new country. Though the future is looking relatively better and peace can possibly be achieved, the horrifying reality far outweighs the positives or the optimistic outcomes in the situation. Each point that will be discussed is a counterpoint to every issue or resolution in the previous paragraphs. Everything stated about ISIS lacking resources and losing land is true. However, the global force of their actions needs to be recognized as they are extremely dangerous and almost irremovable. Yes, foreign powers can totally eliminate ISIS forces and retake the land for Iraq and Syria, and also make efforts to domestically find terrorists who work in the name of ISIS, but people will always slip through the cracks and commit horrendous and irrevocable acts of terror. Even if ISIS ceases to exist entirely in the next 5 years, their extremist values and influential hand will still be present, because when people who are of these extreme beliefs or who are festering anger and hate need to release this, they will look to prime examples of terrorist attacks committed by ISIS in the past 3 years and commit similar acts on the behalf of them or in tribute to them. Now we have to assess the war itself, both domestically and globally. The rebels versus Assad conflict itself does not have a near end in sight unless Assad backs down from power or extinguishes the rebel forces entirely, both of which are unlikely. In the light of the second option, rebellions will continue to form to oppose his dictatorship, and the elimination of these rebel groups are only a temporary solution for Assad's corrupt administration to continue on. From a less microscopic standpoint, the politics and entanglement of world powers is also a touchy subject. The USA is between a rock and a hard place here. If they stop their initiative in assisting the rebel forces, the fighting will continue in a paradoxical power struggle. If the USA continues aiding the rebels, their involvement could deepen even further, possibly with the US just blatantly entering the war. I'm not saying this is probable, but there is that possibility if the conflict breaks international terms of warfare, like the use of chemical warfare already, or if it begins to directly affect the US in some way. In addition to the moral conundrum of the U.S., continuing to support rebel forces would further the increasingly unstable and complicated relationship between the United States and Assad's ally, Russia. Russia's involvement is also very complex. Because of the long-lasting and historical ties between Russia and Syria, and the oil profits that Russia benefits from in Syria, Putin and his government have no reason to remove their presence from Syria. If Russia does not pull out or becomes more involved, Assad will never give up his power, and the rebels and the Syrian people in general will remain in fear and war and oppression. It is a dark reality. The Syrian war is a deeply complicated and paradoxical crisis in the Middle East that affects the world in its entirety. It involves many religiously charged groups with conflicting ideas and values who are seemingly supervised by larger foreign powers like the United States and Russia. From both a positive view and a negative view, the war has progressed little in the way of major advances for either side, and an end to the violence and unrest is not in the very near future, unfortunately.